Greetings, fellow primates. Just Pattis here. Welcome to the zoo. In each episode of this series, I'll be adding something new to my Minecraft zoo while sharing stories from my years working with animals. If a zookeeper ever tells you that they've never had an animal escape, they're definitely lying. Between mechanical failures, forces of nature, and just plain human error, there are a million ways for an animal to end up somewhere it shouldn't be. I don't know a single zoo with a perfect track record. Now, not every escape is some high stakes life or death emergency. Some of them are honestly just comedy. Our capybara, for example. This guy was a certified escape artist. Normally, when you hear about animals escaping, you picture something with a little more processing power. Maybe something with opposable thumbs. So, how does a 100-pound potato with legs manage to outsmart its keepers on multiple occasions? Well, it started when he was a baby. He figured out that he could climb on top of his hay feeder and use it as a step stool to just hop right over the edge of his nursery pen. Thankfully, he was still inside the nursery building, so getting him back with his siblings was pretty easy. And once he graduated to his outdoor habitat, the escapes stopped. For a while. Over time, the wooden gate to his enclosure started sagging, and it became pretty difficult to latch from the inside. So during cleaning, people would usually just pull it shut without actually latching it. And the capybara noticed. And he realized that if he leaned on the gate hard enough, freedom. I will never forget walking outside one morning to find one of my coworkers chasing a capybara around who was just living his absolute best life. Thankfully, he was still inside the outer service fence, so it's not like he was loose in the zoo. He was just happily jogging down this 3-foot wide corridor, stopping every few feet to snack on tufts of grass while my coworker exasperatingly tried to herd him back home. Capybaras are usually pretty cooperative, but if they don't want to move, you're not going to make them move. They are built like tanks. You aren't just picking one up and carrying it back. Luckily, they're also pretty calm, and a handful of treats can usually solve most problems. The first time one of our volunteers accidentally let him out, she called me in an absolute panic and was totally mortified. A few treats later, he was back in his enclosure like nothing had even happened, and by the end of the day, she was able to laugh about it. A capybara escape is mostly just an exercise in convincing an oversized guinea pig that the grass really is greener back inside his habitat. Now, not every escape is that relaxing, unfortunately. Some animals escaping will absolutely send your heart rate through the roof, and not even necessarily because they're dangerous to people, but because you know your odds of getting them back are basically zero. One of the craziest escapes I experienced involved a Eurasian eagle owl. These birds are enormous, with wingspans reaching 6 feet. That is a huge bird. So we had just gotten him, and while his permanent exhibit was being finished, he was living in a temporary enclosure. Because it was temporary, there wasn't a double door entry system. You had to just kind of slip through the door quickly. Unfortunately, the owl was pretty calm. He was basically always sitting quietly on the perch furthest away from the entrance. But still, because of the situation, the owner was understandably very particular about who was allowed inside to take care of him. So on days when the zoo was closed and only 1 or 2 employees were working, he fed the owl himself. And honestly, I think the owl intimidated him a little, which, to be fair, is understandable. Razor-sharp talons, a beak designed to literally rip apart prey, they're impressive birds. So whenever we dealt with this bird, we wore these thick leather raptor gloves that went up to your elbows. So they offered a lot of protection, but they also made your hands about as useful as oven mitts. Now one day, the owner stepped inside to feed the owl, but the concrete floor had gotten wet and was unusually slippery. He lost his footing just enough to startle the owl, and the bird launched into the air. The owner instinctively reached for the door, but with those bulky gloves on, instead of grabbing it and pulling it shut, he shoved the door wide open, and out flew the owl. The zoo is in a pretty rural area, surrounded by miles of woods, and so at that moment, we all assumed that we'd never see him again. Days passed, everybody was looking up to the trees to see if they could see him, and nothing. We pretty much just accepted that he was gone. Then, the owner got a phone call. Someone who lived down the road was like, "Hey, are you guys maybe missing a bird?" He said that he saw a gigantic owl, bigger than any owl he'd ever seen, and it had just landed on his porch railing. So the owner grabbed Annette, another employee, and headed over, and somehow they actually got the owl back. Needless to say, after that day, he moved into an enclosure with a much more secure entry system. Now, obviously, birds are stressful because they can fly, but they usually have one thing going against them, and it's that they're not exactly masterminds. I mean, the phrase bird-brained exists for a reason. Now, imagine combining the ability to disappear into the treetops with mischief and just enough intelligence to evade capture. And that's what happens when a primate escapes. That's when things get interesting. The first primate escape I ever witnessed happened not long after I started my first zoo job. It was winter, business was slow, and so I spent most of my days just hanging around the monkeys and lemurs, handing out treats, playing with them, and just making sure visitors didn't do anything ridiculous. I was still young and inexperienced, so I really wasn't doing much hands-on animal care yet. So I was wandering around the primate area while one of the full-time keepers was cleaning all of the monkey houses, and I happened to glance over, and sitting on top of one of the enclosures was one of our black and white ruffed lemurs. I looked at the keeper, he looked at me, neither of us said anything, but we both had the exact same expression. Oh no. He immediately radioed for help while I slowly started easing closer. Now this lemur, he was young and playful, not super particular about people he liked versus didn't like. Basically, as long as you gave him back scratches, he'd be your best friend. So, naturally, I had spent a lot of time getting to know this lemur. By the time more staff arrived, I'd managed to get within a few feet of him without startling him. And then completely out of nowhere, he jumped. Right onto my shoulder. I froze. 16-year-old me was standing in the middle of a zoo with a lemur sitting on my shoulder like I was some kind of Disney princess. If you had told me 2 months earlier that this was going to happen, I probably would have laughed in your face. The manager quietly told me to start walking toward the open enclosure door, very, very slowly, and so I did. I tried to keep every movement as smooth as possible while 3 employees surrounded me with nets, ready to go if anything went sideways. I got about 2 feet away from the doorway when the lemur suddenly leapt from my shoulder onto a nearby railing. One keeper swept him up in a net, deposited him into the enclosure, and in one smooth motion, the escape was over, just like that. The whole thing probably only lasted like 5 minutes. The adrenaline, though, that stuck around for the rest of the day. Working in a zoo teaches you pretty quickly that no enclosure is ever completely escape-proof, and every keeper eventually ends up with a story like this one. Sometimes it's a capybara taking himself for a walk. Sometimes it's a 6-foot owl deciding he wants an aerial view of the neighborhood, and sometimes you become a very unexpected taxi service for a lemur. Thankfully, everyone made it home safely, and hopefully the only thing escaping in today's Minecraft zoo is my terrible building skills. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to join the troop so you don't miss the next one. I've got plenty more where these came from. Until next time, stay wild.